I want to take a bit of a turn because you talk about the structure of policing in your book, and you identify seven seven different levels of policing in this country. Um, can you dive into those levels and talk a bit about them?
Sure, and I'll precisely because you're not reading the text and people are listening, I'll make it slightly less complex. But the basic idea is this: in thinking about problems of police violence, the first question you might ask yourself is this: what are the forces that creates the possibility for police officers to interact with Black people to begin with? And the reason one wants to ask that question is this: repeated exposure to the police creates the possibility that they can harm you. If you're not having contact with the police, they can't stop and frisk you, they can't kill you. So a central question is, what are the factors that puts African Americans in front of the police? I argue Fourth Amendment is one such factor. So that's one important structure we need to think about. Another important structure has to do with police culture, police trainings, police unions. If police culture encourages violence even implicitly, then clearly you will see violence. If police trainings don't attend to problems of violence, clearly you will see violence. And if police unions are much more interested in, say, protecting police officers and holding them accountable, again, you'll see violence. Another crucial question that we sometimes don't think enough about is this: what happens when police violence interacts with the legal system? By that I mean, there's no dispute that someone's been brutalized, no dispute that someone's been killed. What now happens when one brings those facts in front of the legal system? What are the outputs? One output is justifiable force. Police violence plus the legal system equals justifiable force. And there are a number of ways in which your listeners, I know, have seen this. One is prosecutorial decisions not to bring charges. Someone's been brutalized, someone's been killed, but the prosecutor says, I'm not going to bring charges. That's a justifiable force moment. Or the prosecutor brings charges, but the grand jury says, we're not going to issue an indictment. That's another moment in which police violence, legal system, justifiable force. Or prosecutor brings charges, grand jury issues an indictment, and a judge or a jury says no conviction. These are all moments in which police violence, fact, enters the legal system and comes out as justifiable force. That's one problem. Another problem, of course, is qualified immunity. I'm not in this moment going to get into the whole of qualified immunity, because if I do, you'll be saying, come back, Devon, come back, and I won't be able to. But the point is that everyone understands that qualified immunity erects a really high bar to holding police officers accountable. Everyone kind of gets that. The debate is whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, not whether it's a thing. The problem is even worse in the sense that assuming you jump the qualified immunity hurdle and you win a lawsuit against a police officer, assuming you do that, who pays the damages? Not the police officer, your tax dollars. Cities and municipalities end up paying. And finally, try suing a police department or a city for acts of violence in which its officers engage. You will not win. That is an impossible project.
Well, you
So unless the
mentioned,
Sorry,
sorry
go
to
ahead.
cut you off, but Breonna Taylor's the money that was paid to her family is a great example of that coming out of the coffers of the taxpayer, as opposed to the police department being held accountable. Continue. I apologize.
And you can have, and there are lots and lots of examples of just that point. The disparity is quite staggering between what police officers actually pay and what cities and municipalities pay. So we are paying for police violence is the way to think about it.
And we're experiencing this in real time in the fallout from the Uvalde massacre, where you see the police department got 40% of the town's budget in Uvalde, and it seems that they are dodging or attempting to cover up something because their story has changed around a dozen times about what actually went down when there was the active mass shooter inside of that elementary school. And I'm a bit frustrated because it feels like we're still having the same conversation and Republicans are already saying police need more funding when they were incredibly well funded. There were tens of police officers there with as much gear as they could possibly imagine, and it still seemed to do nothing, and they're still lying and hiding from investigators within the state of Texas. Why do you see, I'm curious about your thoughts about what's happening in Uvalde, but two, why is there this persistent desire seemingly from a lot of the public to see these incidents as anomalies as opposed to obvious patterns?
So I want to answer your question not by talking about that particular moment in a way, because we have more information, more data that's available to your listeners and that I would encourage them to take a look at by way of Ferguson. Why do I say by way of Ferguson? Because Ferguson ended up producing a Department of Justice report. And that report is a must read. Why? Because it reveals the extent to which racism and classism were bureaucratized as ordinary features of governance. By that I mean, the report reveals the degree to which policing was employed as a revenue-generating mechanism and ended up funding 20 to 35% of the city's budget. So you see how this ties into the question that you raised. We have that data. We know how it operates, where people are issued fines, right, that they can't pay. So the standard way in which this worked was something like this. You get a warrant for something ridiculous. You show up, let's say, because there's a mandatory court appearance. You can't afford to pay. What happens? Well, maybe you get arrested in the spot, or you get a higher fine, or plausibly, you get your driver's license revoked, and then you drive without your driver's license and you're arrested. I mean, all of this resulted in a regime of social control where people would find themselves fined, arrested, incarcerated, can't get out of jail because they have no money to post bail, and the collateral consequences of all of that. So it's implicated not just police officers, but a system of governance writ large, which is why it's a mistake to have a conversation about policing that focuses on whether individual police officers are engaged in individual acts of violence against individual Black people. That's not the way to think about it. We should be asking ourselves, what are the sources of police power? How are those sources implicated in government? And how can we peel away at those particular structures?